The day Venezuela almost started World War III and no one noticed. Let me take you back to March 12, 2024, a Tuesday, unremarkable in most ways, until it wasn't. That was the day a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, surfaced within visual range of the USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group in the Caribbean. The Pentagon's initial statement called it a routine maritime interaction. The White House press secretary dismissed it as a non-event. CNN ran a 30-second segment with a retired admiral shrugging it off as posturing. And just like that, the story vanished from the news cycle. But here's the I've spent the last 30 years studying naval brinkmanship, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony. And let me tell you, this wasn't just another close call. This was the kind of incident that, in a different era, might have triggered a naval engagement, a retaliatory strike, or worse. The fact that it didn't escalate doesn't mean it wasn't dangerous, it means we got lucky. And in geopolitics, luck is not a strategy. So why did a Venezuelan sub, a country under crushing sanctions, with a military that can barely keep its MiG-29s in the air, suddenly decide to play chicken with the most powerful carrier group in the world? The official narrative is Nicolas Maduro, desperate to distract from his collapsing economy and rigged elections, ordered a reckless provocation to rally nationalist sentiment. The U.S., ever the responsible superpower, exercised restaurant case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon's after-action report, the Caribe was conducting routine training exercises when it inadvertently closed to within 5,000 yards of the bush before surfacing. The U.S. Navy, demonstrating professionalism and discipline, issued a standard radio warning, and the Venezuelan vessel complied, altering course without further incident. The State Department called it a misunderstanding, and Secretary Blinken even praised the Venezuelan Navy's prompt response in a carefully worded statement. The media, predictably, ran with the nothing to see here angle. The New York Times buried the story on page A12 under the headline Venezuela tests U.S. patience with naval maneuvers. Fox News, ever eager to stoke fear, led with Maduro's Navy dares America, will Biden strike back? But even they moved on after a day. The narrative was Venezuela, a failing state with delusions of grandeur, had blundered into a dangerous game and gotten away with it. The U.S., as always, had shown restraint. But here's where the story starts to unravel. First, the Caribe isn't some rust bucket barely held together by duct tape. It's a Type 209/1300 submarine, one of the most advanced non-nuclear subs in the region, purchased from Germany in the 1980s and upgraded multiple times since. It's quiet, it's lethal, and most importantly, it's not the kind of vessel you send on a routine training exercise within torpedo range of a carrier strike group unless you're either suicidal or sending a message. Second, the Bush wasn't just cruising through the Caribbean on a pleasure voyage. The carrier group had been deployed to the region in response to intelligence reports of increased Russian and Iranian activity, specifically, the presence of the Admiral Gorshkov, a Russian frigate armed with hypersonic Zircon missiles, and the Iris Makran, an Iranian forward base ship that had been shadowing U.S. vessels for weeks. The Bush was there to remind everyone who still runs the seas. So why would Venezuela, of all countries, pick that moment to poke the bear? Third, and most damning, is the timing. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It came just days after the U.S. Treasury Department announced new sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil exports, sanctions that, if fully enforced, would cut off the last remaining lifeline of Maduro's regime. It came after a closed-door meeting between Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov and Venezuelan officials in Caracas, where Ryabkov reportedly warned that Venezuela's sovereignty would be defended by any means necessary. And it came after a leaked intelligence report suggested that China had quietly increased its arms shipments to Venezuela, including advanced anti-ship missiles. So let's a Venezuelan submarine operated by a navy that hasn't engaged in a real naval battle since the 19th century suddenly decides to play cat and mouse with the most powerful carrier group in the world, at the exact moment when Venezuela is facing economic strangulation, Russian support is ramping up, and the U.S. is flexing its muscles in the region. Does that sound like a misunderstanding to you? What's really the hidden chessboard? Here's what the official narrative won't tell: this wasn't just Maduro's desperate gamble. It was a calculated move in a much larger game, one where Venezuela is no longer the player, but the pawn. Let's start with the most obvious: why would Maduro risk a direct confrontation with the US? The answer isn't just because he's a dictator with nothing to lose. It's because he's a dictator with everything to lose, and he's been given a green light by powers that see Venezuela as a pressure point against Washington. For years, Venezuela has been a client state of Russia and China. Moscow has propped up Maduro with loans, arms, and diplomatic cover at the UN. Beijing has done the same, though with a longer-term economic play, securing access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves and rare earth minerals. But in the last 12 months, something has changed. The relationship has shifted from support to integration. In January, Russia announced the deployment of military advisors to Venezuela, not just the usual Wagner Group mercenaries, but active duty officers from the GRU, Russia's military intelligence. Their mission? To help Venezuela modernize its air defenses and coastal missile batteries. Around the same time, China began construction on a new deepwater port in La Guaira, just outside Caracas, capable of handling military vessels. And in February, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps quietly established a presence in Venezuela, training local forces in asymmetric warfare. Now, put yourself in Maduro's shoes. You're facing economic collapse, mass protests, and the very real possibility of a US-backed coup or invasion. But you've also been told by Russia, by China, by Iran, that if you push back hard enough, the US will blink. That's not just bluster. It's a lesson these powers have learned from the West's appetite for escalation is limited. If you can make the cost of intervention too high, you can carve out a sphere of influence. So when the Caribbean surfaced near the bush, it wasn't just a Venezuelan provocation. It was a joint provocation. A test. A way to see how far the US was willing to go before it backed down. And here's the US did back down. Not in the way the media reported, with stern statements and diplomatic channels. No, the real retreat happened behind the. In other words, the message was received. Venezuela had called Washington's bluff, and Washington had folded. But why? Why would the US, with all its military might, back down from a single submarine in its own backyard? The answer lies in the bigger game. The great power: why Venezuela matters more than you think. Let me be: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the slow, grinding collapse of American unipolarity and the rise of a new multipolar order, one where the US no longer gets to dictate the rules of the game. For the last 3 decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can project power anywhere, anytime, with impunity. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, these weren't just wars. They were demonstrations of American hegemony. The message was: cross us, and we will break you. But that era is ending. And the reason isn't just that the US is tired of war. It's that its adversaries have finally figured out how to fight back. Russia, China, and Iran aren't trying to match the US military head-on. They're playing a different game, one where the goal isn't to win battles, but to raise the cost of intervention until the US decides it's not worth the fight. They're doing this in 3. 1. Asymmetric escalation. They're deploying weapons and tactics that make US power projection too risky. Hypersonic missiles that can sink carriers. Swarms of drones that can overwhelm air defenses. Cyber attacks that can blind entire command structures. The Caribbean incident wasn't just a Venezuelan sub playing chicken, it was a test of whether the US would risk a naval engagement in a region where Russia and Iran could quickly escalate. 2. Proxy warfare. They're turning local conflicts into global quagmires. Ukraine is the obvious example, but look at what's happening in the Middle East, the Sahel, and now Latin America. Every time the US gets bogged down in one theater, another front opens up. Venezuela isn't just a problem for the US, it's a distraction. A way to tie down American resources while Russia and China consolidate their gains elsewhere. 3. Economic coercion. They're weaponizing trade, energy, and finance to erode US influence. China's Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about infrastructure, it's about creating a parallel economic system that doesn't rely on the dollar. Russia's energy blackmail in Europe is a preview of what's coming in Latin America, where Venezuela's oil could be used as a tool to punish US allies. Now, let's connect the dots. The Caribbean incident wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about testing whether the US would respond to a direct challenge in its own hemisphere at a time when its military is stretched thin, its domestic politics are in chaos, and its adversaries are probing for weaknesses. And the US failed the test. That's not just my opinion. It's the conclusion of a classified Pentagon wargame conducted last year, which simulated a Venezuelan-Russian-Iranian naval blockade of the Caribbean. The result? The US Navy struggled to maintain control, and any attempt to escalate risked a wider conflict with Russia. The report's conclusion was the US no longer enjoys uncontested maritime dominance in its own backyard. That's the reality we're living in. And it's why Venezuela, a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, suddenly matters more than ever. The military, why this could have gone very wrong. Now, let's talk about what could have happened and why the next time, we might not be so lucky. The Caribbean is a capable submarine, but it's not invincible. The US Navy has spent decades hunting Soviet and Chinese subs, and its anti-submarine warfare capabilities are second to none. If the Bush strike group had wanted to sink the Caribbean, it could have done so in minutes. But that's not how modern naval warfare works. In the old days, if a hostile sub got too close, you sank it. End of story. But today, every military action is a political action. And in the age of social media, misinformation, and great power competition, the rules have changed. Let's say the Bush had fired on the Caribbean. What happens next? 1. Venezuela declares a defensive war and calls on its allies for support. Russia, which has already warned that any attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on Russia, deploys the Admiral Gorshkov to the region. Iran sends fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles. China, while not directly involved, condemns the US and accelerates arms sales to Venezuela. 2. The US is forced to escalate. More carriers are sent to the Caribbean. The Marines are put on alert. The Pentagon dusts off its old invasion plans for Venezuela. But here's the US doesn't have the forces to fight a three-front war. Not with Ukraine draining resources, the Middle East on fire, and China threatening Taiwan. So what does it do? It blinks. It negotiates. It backs down. 3. The global narrative shifts. The US is no longer the unchallenged superpower. It's a paper tiger that can be humiliated by a third-rate navy. Russia and China use the incident to rally support among non-aligned nations. NATO allies start questioning whether the US can still protect them. And suddenly, the balance of power tilts just a little more toward Moscow and Beijing. That's the nightmare scenario. And it's not hypothetical. It's exactly what happened in 2019, when the US backed Juan Guaido's failed coup attempt in Venezuela. The US expected Maduro to fall within weeks. Instead, Russia and China doubled down on their support, the military stayed loyal, and the US was left looking weak and indecisive. The Caribbean incident was a repeat of that playbook, just with higher stakes. Now, I'm not saying the US should have sunk the sub. In fact, I think the decision to de-escalate was the right one. But that's not because the US is restrained or responsible. It's because the alternative was too dangerous. And that's the real lesson: the US no longer has the luxury of unchallenged dominance. Every move it makes is now calculated against the risk of escalation. Every provocation is a test of resolve. And every time it backs down, its adversaries learn that they can push a little harder next time. The domestic why Biden can't afford to lose Venezuela. Here's something the foreign policy establishment won't tell: the US response to Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics. It's about politics, with a capital P. Let's start with Florida. The Sunshine State is the ultimate swing state, and its Venezuelan-American community is a powerful voting bloc. For years, both parties have competed to see who can be tougher on Maduro. Trump imposed crippling sanctions and flirted with military intervention. Biden kept the sanctions in place and even extended them. Neither approach has worked, but neither side can afford to look soft. Now, imagine the political fallout if the Caribbean incident had escalated. If the US had fired on a Venezuelan sub, the headlines would have been "Biden starts war with Venezuela." The GOP would have gone into overdrive, accusing the administration of weakness and appeasement. The left wing of the Democratic Party would have revolted, demanding an end to endless wars. And in the middle of an election year, with Biden already struggling in the polls, that's a disaster scenario. But here's the same dynamic applies to Trump. If he were president, he'd be under even more pressure to respond. His base demands toughness. His advisors would be whispering in his ear about restoring American strength. And if he hesitated? The media would crucify him for being Putin's puppet. That's the trap. No matter who's in the White House, the domestic political incentives push toward escalation even when escalation is the worst possible option. And that's how you get incidents like the Caribbean. Not because anyone wants a war, but because the system rewards posturing over prudence. What happens next? 3 scenarios for Venezuela and the world. So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities, from least to most likely. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this best-case scenario, the US and Venezuela enter into back-channel negotiations. The US eases some sanctions in exchange for Maduro allowing free elections. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to avoid a costly proxy war, pressure Maduro to compromise. The Caribbean incident is forgotten, and Venezuela slowly reintegrates into the global economy. Why Maduro has no incentive to give up power. Russia and China would see any US victory as a strategic defeat. And the US political system is too polarized to sustain a long-term diplomatic effort. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. The US keeps sanctions in place but avoids direct confrontation. Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis like Cuba, but with oil. Russia and China continue to prop up Maduro, using Venezuela as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. The Caribbean incident is just the first of many close calls, as the US and its adversaries engage in a low-intensity shadow war in the Caribbean. Why its frozen conflicts have a way of thawing at the worst possible moment. One miscalculation, one accident, and suddenly you're in a shooting war. Scenario 3, the escalation spiral. In this worst-case scenario, the US decides it can't afford to look weak. It ramps up sanctions, funds opposition groups, and maybe even authorizes covert action. Venezuela, backed by Russia and Iran, responds with cyber attacks, sabotage, and more naval provocations. The Caribbean incident is just the opening act. The real showdown comes when the US tries to enforce a naval blockade, and Venezuela, backed by Russia and Iran, responds with cyber attacks, sabotage, and more naval provocations. The Caribbean incident is just the opening act. The real showdown comes when the US tries to enforce a naval blockade, and suddenly, the Caribbean isn't just a theater of competition, but a potential flashpoint for great power war. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US Navy hasn't conducted a full-scale blockade since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And back then, the Soviet Union was a nuclear peer with a global reach. Today, Russia is a declining power with a navy that's a shadow of its Cold War self except in one critical: submarines. The Kilo-class boats they've sold to Venezuela are quiet, lethal, and designed specifically to hunt aircraft carriers. The Caribbean wasn't just a provocation, it was a demonstration. A warning. We can reach you where you're strongest. Let me explain why this matters. The US military's entire post-Cold War strategy has been built on the assumption of unchallenged naval dominance. The Carrier Strike Group is the crown jewel of American power projection. But what happens when that dominance is contested? When a regional power, even a weak one like Venezuela, can credibly threaten a $13 billion warship with a $300 million submarine? The calculus changes. And not just for the US, but for every ally that depends on American security guarantees. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not prepared for this kind of warfare. Not really. The last time the Navy seriously trained for submarine hunting was in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was the adversary. Since then, the focus has been on counterterrorism, ballistic missile defense, and projecting power ashore. The anti-submarine warfare skills that won the Cold War have atrophied. The P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, the Virginia-class attack submarines, the new MQ-4C Triton drones, all of these are world-class systems, but they're only as good as the sailors and pilots who operate them. And right now, the U.S. Navy is stretched thinner than it's been in decades. Consider the numbers. In 2023, the Navy had 296 deployable ships. By 2030, that number is projected to drop to 280, even as China's fleet surpasses 400. The U.S. has 11 aircraft carriers. China has 3, but they're building more, and they're not the only ones. Russia, Iran, and now Venezuela are all investing in asymmetric naval capabilities designed to exploit America's weaknesses. The Caribbean incident wasn't an anomaly, it was a preview. So what does this mean for the escalation spiral? If the U.S. imposes a blockade, it won't be like the ones in Iraq or North Korea, where the adversary had no way to fight back. Venezuela has options. Russia has already demonstrated its willingness to supply advanced weapons. Look at the S-300 air defense systems delivered in 2019, or the recent reports of Iranian-made ballistic missiles being smuggled into the country. Iran, for its part, has spent decades perfecting the art of asymmetric naval warfare in the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is a laboratory for the kind of tactics Venezuela could use in the swarming fast attack boats, sea mines, and, yes, submarines. And then there's the cyber dimension. In 2021, a ransomware attack crippled Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. The U.S. has never officially taken credit, but the timing, just as the Biden administration was tightening sanctions, was suspicious. If the U.S. escalates, Venezuela and its allies won't just respond with ships and missiles. They'll go after the soft underbelly of America, the financial system, the energy grid, the supply chains that keep the U.S. military running. Russia has already shown how effective this can be. In 2015, a cyber attack took down Ukraine's power grid. In 2022, Russian hackers hit U.S. satellite networks during the early days of the war in Ukraine. The Caribbean incident might be the first shot in a conflict that's fought as much in cyberspace as it is on the high seas. Now, let's talk about the regional fallout. The U.S. has spent decades trying to isolate Venezuela, but the reality is that Maduro has more friends in the hemisphere than Washington would like to admit. Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, they're all sympathetic to Venezuela's plight, and they're all watching closely to see how the U.S. responds. If the U.S. overreacts, it risks pushing these countries even closer to Russia and China. If it underreacts, it emboldens them to challenge American influence in their own backyards. Take Brazil, for example. Lula da Silva has made no secret of his desire to position Brazil as a mediator in global conflicts. If the U.S. and Venezuela go head-to-head, Lula will see an opportunity to play peacemaker and to extract concessions from both sides. The same goes for Mexico, where President López Obrador has already shown a willingness to chart an independent course on foreign policy. The last thing the U.S. wants is for the Caribbean to become a battleground where every regional player feels compelled to pick a side. And then there's Colombia. The U.S. has long seen Colombia as its most reliable partner in South America, but the relationship has been strained under President Gustavo Petro. Petro has made it clear that he wants to reduce Colombia's dependence on the U.S., and he's been vocal in his criticism of American interventionism. If the U.S. escalates against Venezuela, Petro could use it as an excuse to distance himself even further from Washington. That's a problem, because Colombia is the linchpin of U.S. counter-narcotics efforts in the region. Lose Colombia, and you lose the war on drugs. Here's the bottom: the Caribbean incident wasn't just a close call. It was a wake-up call. The U.S. can no longer assume that its naval dominance is unassailable. It can no longer assume that its adversaries will play by the old rules. And it can no longer assume that its allies will automatically fall in line. The world is entering a new era of naval competition, and the Caribbean is the first testing ground. So what happens next? If we're lucky, we'll get Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. The U.S. and Venezuela will continue to trade barbs, sanctions will remain in place, and the Caribbean incident will to the background. But if we're not lucky, we'll get Scenario 3, the escalation spiral. And if that happens, the next time a Venezuelan submarine gets too close to a U.S. carrier, the outcome might not be a stern warning. It might be a torpedo in the water. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the latest symptom of a much deeper crisis inside Venezuela, one that the Maduro regime is desperately trying to paper over with military posturing. Let me explain why this matters for the domestic political dimension, because that's where the real pressure points are. First, let's talk about the economy. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, according to the IMF. That's not a recession, it's an economic apocalypse. Hyperinflation peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2018, and while it's slowed since then, the bolivar is still essentially worthless. The minimum wage is about $3.50 a month. $3.50. That's not a typo. Meanwhile, the black market for dollars thrives, and the regime's elite, what's left of Chavismo's inner circle, control the few remaining profitable sectors, like gold mining and oil smuggling. The state-owned PDVSA, once the crown jewel of Venezuela's economy, is now a hollowed-out shell, producing less than 800,000 barrels a day, down from 3.5 million in 1998. The U.S. sanctions have crippled what was left of its export capacity, but let's be the rot started long before Trump's Treasury Department got involved. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just surviving, he's consolidating power. And he's doing it by weaponizing the very crisis that should have destroyed him. Since 2019, when Juan Guaido's interim government was recognized by over 50 countries, Maduro has systematically dismantled the opposition. He's arrested or exiled its leaders, banned them from running for office, and rigged elections so thoroughly that even the most optimistic observers now call them a farce. The 2020 parliamentary elections? Turnout was below 30%. The 2021 regional elections? The opposition was allowed to participate, but only after most of its candidates were disqualified. The 2024 presidential election? We'll get to that in a moment. Now, you might: if the economy is in freefall and the opposition is neutered, why does Maduro need to pick a fight with the US? Why risk provoking a naval confrontation when your people are starving? The answer is because he's running out of other options. The regime's legitimacy has always been built on two pillars: Chavez's cult of personality and the promise of oil-fueled prosperity. Chavez is dead, and the oil money is gone. What's left? Fear, repression, and the illusion of resistance. Every time Maduro thumps his chest at the US, he's not just playing to the international gallery. He's reminding his domestic audience that he's still the strongman, the defender of the revolution, the man who stands up to the empire. But here's where it gets complicated. The regime isn't monolithic. There are factions within Chavismo, hardliners like Diosdado Cabello, who controls the Constituent Assembly, and pragmatists like Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who has been quietly negotiating with the US over sanctions relief. The military, too, is divided. The top brass is deeply corrupt, but the rank-and-file are suffering just like everyone else. Desertions have been a problem for years, and the regime has responded with brutal purges. In 2021, Maduro arrested over 100 military officers on charges of treason. The message was: loyalty is non-negotiable. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election. Maduro has already signaled that he'll run again, despite the fact that the Constitution technically bars him from a third term. The opposition is in disarray. Maria Corina Machado, the most popular opposition figure, was banned from running in 2023. Enrique Capriles, who came close to beating Maduro in 2013, is now a spent force. The only viable opposition candidate left is Edmundo González Urrutia, a little-known diplomat who was essentially handed the nomination because everyone else was disqualified. The regime has already started its usual intimidation, media blackouts, and legal harassment. But here's the thing: Maduro doesn't need to win a fair election. He just needs to win an election that's just plausible enough to avoid triggering a new round of sanctions or, worse, a military intervention. Which brings us back to the submarine incident. If you're Maduro, what better way to rally the base than by provoking the US? The narrative writes: the empire is coming for us. We must stand firm. The revolution is under attack. It's a tried-and-true tactic, and it works, at least in the short term. But it's also a gamble. The more Maduro escalates, the more he risks pushing the US into a corner. And if the US decides that regime change is back on the table, Maduro's domestic support could evaporate overnight. Let me give you a historical parallel. In 1989, when the US invaded AMA to remove Manuel Noriega, the Amanian dictator thought he could rally his people by playing the nationalist card. He declared a state of war with the US, and for a few days, it looked like he might pull it off. But when the bombs started falling, his support collapsed. The same thing happened in Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein thought he could ride out the US invasion by appealing to Arab nationalism. He was wrong. The question is, Maduro making the same mistake? Here's the scenario I'm watching closely. If the US decides to tighten the screws, say, by imposing secondary sanctions on Venezuela's oil exports or by designating the regime as a state sponsor of terrorism, Maduro will have two choices. He can double down on the confrontation, which risks further isolating Venezuela and accelerating the economy's collapse. Or he can pivot to negotiations, which would require making concessions that could undermine his grip on power. Neither option is appealing, which is why he's likely to keep playing this dangerous game of brinkmanship. But here's the Venezuelan people. For years, they've been too exhausted to protest. The 2017 demonstrations, which saw millions take to the streets, were crushed with brutal efficiency. The regime learned its lesson: it's not enough to arrest the leaders. You have to break the people's will. And for a while, it worked. But hunger has a way of radicalizing people. The recent protests in the state of Taquira, where people took to the streets over food shortages, are a sign that the patience of the Venezuelan people is not infinite. If Maduro pushes too far, he could find himself facing a new wave of unrest, one that even his security forces might not be able to contain. So where does that leave us? If I had to put money on it, I'd say we're heading toward a period of prolonged instability, where Maduro alternates between provocation and conciliation, always keeping his options open. The US will respond with a mix of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and occasional shows of force, like the recent deployment of the USS George Washington to the Caribbean. But neither side wants a full-blown conflict. The US has too many other fires to put out, and Maduro knows that a war would be the end of his regime. The real question is whether this equilibrium can hold. Because if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that dictatorships don't collapse because of outside pressure. They collapse when their own people stop believing in them. And in Venezuela, that moment might be closer than anyone thinks. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of US grand strategy in Latin America. For decades, Washington has treated the region as a secondary theater, a place where stability could be outsourced to local strongmen or managed through periodic interventions. The Monroe Doctrine, in its modern incarnation, has been less about direct control and more about ensuring no rival power gains a foothold. But that approach is crumbling, and Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 30 years pivoting between two flawed strategies in Latin, either ignoring the region until a crisis forces its hand, or overcorrecting with heavy-handed policies that backfire. The first approach, benign neglect, gave us the rise of Chavez in the 1990s, a man who exploited American indifference to build a populist movement that reshaped the continent. The second approach, sanctions, coups, and covert ops, gave us the current mess in Venezuela, where Maduro has used US pressure to rally nationalist sentiment and justify his authoritarianism. Here's the uncomfortable: neither strategy works in the 21st century. The world has changed. China and Russia aren't just meddling in Venezuela for fun, they're playing a long game, one that exploits America's blind spots. China's $60 billion in loans to Venezuela since 2007 weren't charity. They were an investment in a client state that could serve as a beachhead for Beijing's influence in the Western Hemisphere. Russia's Wagner Group operatives in Caracas aren't there to prop up Maduro out of ideological solidarity, they're there to secure a strategic partner in America's backyard, one that can be used to distract and destabilize the US when needed. And yet, Washington still doesn't have a coherent alternative. The Biden administration's approach, targeted sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the occasional military show of force, is a holding pattern, not a strategy. It's the geopolitical equivalent of treading water. The problem is that treading water only works if you're not being pulled under by a riptide. And right now, the riptide is getting stronger. Take the recent incident with the Venezuelan submarine. Most analysts will tell you it was a reckless provocation, a desperate gamble by a regime that's running out of options. And they're not wrong. But what they're missing is the bigger Maduro isn't just lashing out because he's cornered. He's testing the limits of U.S. resolve. He wants to know how far he can push before Washington either backs down or overreacts. And if history is any guide, the U.S. has a habit of doing both, sometimes in the same crisis. Remember the Bay of Pigs? The U.S. backed a half-baked invasion that failed spectacularly, then spent the next decade trying to contain the fallout. Or the 1989 invasion of AMA? The U.S. removed Noriega in a blaze of glory, only to leave behind a power vacuum that took years to stabilize. Even the more recent example of Colombia, where Plan Colombia succeeded in weakening the FARC but also entrenched a corrupt political class, shows the limits of military-first approaches. So what's the alternative? If I were advising the White House, I'd argue for a three-pronged strategy that combines pressure, engagement, and contingency planning. First, maintain the sanctions but couple them with a clear off-ramp. Maduro needs to believe that there's a way out that doesn't involve him ending up in The Hague. That means back-channel negotiations, not public ultimatums. Second, work with regional allies Brazil, Colombia, Mexico to create a unified front. The Lima Group was a good start, but it fractured when its members realized that isolating Venezuela wasn't enough. They need a positive agenda, one that offers the Venezuelan people a credible alternative to Maduro's rule. And third, prepare for the worst. If the regime collapses, the U.S. and its allies need to be ready to step in not with troops, but with a Marshall Plan for Venezuela. That means humanitarian aid, economic reconstruction, and a political transition that doesn't repeat the mistakes of Iraq or Libya. But here's the: none of this will work if the U.S. doesn't address its own contradictions. Washington can't on one hand condemn Maduro's authoritarianism while on the other hand cozying up to Saudi Arabia or turning a blind eye to human rights abuses in Honduras. The U.S. needs to decide what it stands for in Latin America. Is it a partner in democracy and development, or is it just another great power playing the same old game of divide and conquer? Let me be: I'm not naive. I don't think Maduro is suddenly going to see the light and hold free elections. I don't think China and Russia are going to pack up and leave. And I don't think the Venezuelan people are going to magically unite behind a single opposition leader. But I do think that the current trajectory is unsustainable. Something has to give. Either the U.S. changes its approach, or it risks watching Venezuela become a permanent crisis, a failed state on its doorstep, a haven for transnational crime, and a staging ground for its rivals. And that brings me to the final P. The real tragedy of Venezuela isn't just that it's a dictatorship. It's that it didn't have to be this way. In the 1970s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America, a stable democracy with a thriving middle class. Today, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when a country's institutions collapse, when its leaders prioritize power over people, and when the world's most powerful nation treats it as an afterthought. So where does that leave us? I'll tell you where it leaves me. It leaves me with a sense of unease, because I've seen this movie before. I've seen what happens when great powers ignore the warning signs until it's too late. I've seen what happens when dictators push too far and think they can get away with anything. And I've seen what happens when the people finally say enough is enough. The question isn't whether Venezuela will change. The question is how. Will it be through a negotiated transition, a violent uprising, or a slow-motion collapse? And will the U.S. be part of the solution, or will it be part of the problem? I don't have all the answers. But I do know the status quo is a recipe for disaster. And if we don't start thinking differently about Venezuela, we're going to regret it.